Welcome to the Daily Word, verse by verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we study the book of Galatians. Keep in mind, I am using the Holman Christian Standard Bible, so if you're using a different translation, the read is different, but the message is the same. Also, keep in mind that these Daily Word, verse by verse studies are uploaded to my YouTube channel, BP, The Bible Perspective. That's BP, The Bible Perspective. So like and share these videos and subscribe to BP, The Bible Perspective. Now, we are in chapter 5, and we're going to pick it up in verse 14, but I want to go back to verse 13 and read something. He says, "For you were called to be free, brothers. Only don't use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh." Now, we're going to get into more what the flesh is in a moment and what he means. In the immediate context, of course, you're doing fleshly works. Now, the flesh is your body. Acts in your body, whether good or bad. What is noteworthy is that even religious works could be fleshly. This is important here because he's going to make a huge distinction between these fleshly religious acts. Even today, there are people that they call themselves spiritual. And then when you look and go, well, why do they call themselves spiritual? Because they deny themselves. Maybe they have renounced their wealth. Back in the monasteric era, many, even Christians, people would come to faith, especially wealthy people would come to faith. In their quest for piety, they would give all their wealth away. In fact, it got so bad, they would give their wealth away, and then they would live as hermits. They would go up in the mountains. They would live, they would isolate themselves, and they would, and the idea was the more they abused themselves, they wouldn't bathe. They fast often. And they were doing all of this in a sense to God. See? They figured the more I neglect my body and the pleasures of the world, the more pious they believe to be. Or they thought they were achieving. And all it was just flesh. That's all that was a bunch of flesh. Because notice, the focus was on my body, denying it, robbing it of pleasure, right? The discipline, some of it was discipline, but it was flesh. You know, it's kind of interesting that in the book of Isaiah, chapter 58, he says, now, on the one hand, you guys afflict yourself in a fast. But here's the fast that I like. You go out and feed the poor. Go out and clothe the naked. Those are the kinds of things I like if you're going to fast. Okay? So, he says, if you have been called to be free, brothers, but don't use this freedom as an opportunity to the flesh, but by love, but serve one another through love. Now that right there elevates, it changes the whole dynamic. Because if you're so stuck on keeping the commandments, keeping the law, I have to go to church every Sunday, I got to do these works and all that, you're so centered on yourself. You're so self-centered. Notice he says that you're not loving. Verse 14, for the entire law is fulfilled in one statement: love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out, or you be consumed with one another. Now, the law, if you kind of, with the first 5 books of the Bible was called the Pentateuch. The law, the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses. And they basically was the law. Deuteronomy was the second law. Now, there were some 600 plus commandments and ordinances in the law. And they were really an expansion, an extended explanation of the 10 commandments. Okay? So the 10 commandments. Now, when we come to the New Testament, we're only given 2 commandments, and Paul cites one of them. It says, believe on Jesus Christ and love one another. Those are the two commandments. Now, we don't need any other commandments. Because as we're going to see and later in the chapter, the true work of the Spirit in our heart produces love. We'll come back to that. What does that love produce? So he says the entire law is fulfilled in one statement. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, the purpose of the law, as Paul states in Timothy, the law was not intended for a righteous man, but for the unrighteous man. If we're working the true work of the Spirit in our hearts, I'm not going to steal from you. I'm not going to murder you. I'm not going to covet your things. So in other words, let's concentrate on walking in this one commandment. I'm going to do all the other ones. And that's what Paul is saying right here. But the entire law is fulfilled in one love, in one statement, love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out if you be not consumed one to another. Now there's a hint here that there might have been a division in the church where these Judaizers were concerned. Where there's some who were entertaining these false teachers versus those who were not entertaining the false teachers. And thus now they're kind of bickering among which is the right way to go. And so Paul says, hey, if you bite and devour one another, then right now that's not the way of love, is what he's saying. If you're fighting among one another, okay, then he says, watch out that if you don't be consumed one another. Now verse 16 says, but this I say then, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. Now, right here, we can keep this very simple, because oftentimes people want to say, again, we go back to spirit, and for some reason people, which kind of is a mark that shows you that they really don't know what they're talking about, and it also shows you that they don't know they don't know really what the true work of the Spirit is. In other words, when he says walk by the Spirit, he's not talking about some state, some euphoric state, or visionary state where you look glassy eye and you kind of glide across the screen. No. In fact, he's going to tell you why. If you want to say what true spirituality is. Remember, I said before that there are some religious sects out there. And I'm talking about New Age, by the way. People say that person is spiritual. And I don't even know where to get that definition from. I think it's a ripped off definition of the Bible, of course. It's certainly a mistaught, misapplied. Keeping some religious commandments, traditions, formulas is not spiritual. As I stated it, you're stuck in your flesh. So what is walking by the Spirit? He's going to tell you what spiritual attributes are. But notice he says right here, if you walk in the Spirit, you will not carry out the desires of the flesh. So he just gave us now the true formula of how we can overcome our faults. But first we have to kind of understand what our faults are, what the principal parts are, right? Our spirit versus our flesh. Now our spirit is our inner man, our inner being. Our flesh, of course, is our body. The passions in our body, the 5 physical senses. This is how we contact the world around us, through our 5 physical senses. But the problem, of course, is as this information comes through and is filtered through our 5 physical senses, it stirs the passions in our bodies. But our inner man, who until you are born again has been alienated from the life of God, but now it is when you come to Christ, you are in the Spirit, because you are born of the Spirit. that's very interesting that now you have this tug of war, this fight for control, the control of which direction you're going to go in. What he's saying here is that if you walk by the Spirit, you will not carry out the flesh desires. And more on that in the next video. We'll pick it up at verse 17 in the next video. I'll see you then.